Yeah.
And
So
to think of the connections, it's not that crazy, because you have Moses coming out of Egypt. You have the Sinai connection for the 10 Commandments. You have Jesus and Mary, Joseph and Mary going into Egypt when they're fleeing Herod. Egypt is a place of constant connection with the Levant. And they're so close. The two peoples are very often intertwined in terms of ideology and politics. And that's not a crazy thing to say. Yeah.
It's not only like a fact for the like Julius Caesar, right? And like his company and what happened with all the drama with the emperors. I mean, the beginning of the empire, Roman Empire, but also, you know, we have the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the LXX here in, I think it's in Alexandria, Egypt, where they're doing this most likely at the library. But there's a constant communication, as you say, going on from Egypt to this area. So the question I have, I guess, leading up to this is the Osiris mythology still around at this time? Is it still floating around? People still believing in something like this? And would it have been relevant?
So I'm not going to get into, so I'm not a New Testament scholar, and I'm not going to pretend to be. And there are people that are doing that work, and there are people that know their gospels inside and out. They're they're accepted gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there are people that know the apocryphal gospels, Gospel of Thomas, which has an infancy of Jesus, for instance, and other gospels, right? And many of these found written in Greek, sometimes Coptic in Egypt on papyrus. And so I'm not going to focus on that kind of minutia. There are wonderful scholars who can do that. But what I do want to do is focus on how these religions they have very similar ideas about what divinity is and how divinity works. And the first thing I want to start with, because I made little notes, Derek, is this idea, like, think of this, the idea that God is human enough to be killed, right? That's weird. And the idea that you have that, so for Jesus, we're like, well, yeah, he was like human and everything, and, you know, placed on this earth, put into Mary. We'll get to that. But put in there as a human. And so it's possible for him to be murdered, sacrificed. He can lose his life, and then through that transformation become something greater than he was before.
Yeah.
All of that has an antecedent in Egyptian philosophy and religion with Osiris, who, despite being a god, could be killed by his brother Seth, hacked up into pieces, those pieces spread out all over Egypt so that he could not reconstitute. But how many other divinities can be killed and murdered? Does that happen to the sun god? No. Does it happen to Seth? Can he be killed and murdered? No. Does it happen to any of these other divinities? It's really interesting that it's just this one god that can be killed, and then through that rebirth become more than he was before. And then both of those divinities, this is another really cool parallel, are connected with a harvest. Now, what does Jesus say when he tells his followers, you know, eat this bread? I am this bread. And Osiris is the wheat. He is the wheat. And there are these, and everyone can Google this because it's super fun. There are these things in Egypt, they call them Osiris beds, like a bed that you lie in. Mm-hmm. And they take a bed of earth. Like, think when you order from Amazon or something, some little herb kit, and they send it to you and it has like little fake earth and it's got the little seeds, and you water it and you put it by your windowsill and you're like, oh, I have basil or whatever it is. Yeah. But the Egyptians did this, and they put these things in tombs. They would make a little chia seed kit, and they would put it out in the sun. And as soon as the green sprouts came, they're like, got it. And they would put that in the tomb with the dead person. And then the dead person could be regenerated. But the dead person was like grain. The dead person they're like Osiris. They are reborn seasonally, like the harvest. So now Jesus doesn't say, I am the wheat, I am the harvest, but he's like, eat this bread. Remember me, drink this wine. These are yearly commodities that are harvested once each year, right? Then you keep all your flour and then you continue to make your bread. Harvest all your grapes, you ferment it, you continue to drink the wine. And he identifies with these commodities. And so both of them are harvest gods. They are Dionysian harvest gods who must die and be reborn. And not every divinity dies and is reborn. So it is part of that rebirth cycle And I've got more notes, but you jump in and let me know what you
Yeah.
think about that.
I don't want to step on your notes. So if there's something I say,
Yeah,
you go, oh, I got it right here, then cut me off and
yeah,
jump in.
yeah,
So I love what you're saying here, because the objections I've heard from those who are trying to go, well, this is agricultural, whereas this isn't. And when I'm reading the New Testament, I'm seeing what you're seeing.
yeah.
I'm not saying he's an agricultural, continual, cyclical, dying and rising deity. I am saying, however, if you notice the ritual practices of Christians, yearly they practice the ritual of resurrection through Easter. They yearly practice the birth, right? Like there's in while it's not cyclical in maybe the exact same way it is in Egypt with Osiris, it is cyclical in memory, in practice. And so I find it ironic how there's this quick, it's not identical, therefore it's not this, stop the comparison, because it's our belief.
Right.
Don't touch our sacred belief. This seems to be a big problem, I find.
Remember the word pagan and what it is. Pagan is an invented, I mean, it just means my maiden name, or my mother's maiden name is Pagano, which is wonderful, but it means like peasant person. It means my Italian side is just a bunch of peasant people. But to call somebody a pagan is to call somebody a country bumpkin, a stupid farmer. And to then take all of these religions and say, oh, these polytheistic religions are just pagan. You are othering something. You have to differentiate yourself from these things. So even though you are taking the winter solstice and putting the birth of your Lord on that day, or you're taking the spring equinox and you're putting the resurrection of your Lord on that day, you still want to differentiate and say, no, we're not doing that. And the creation of the Bible as we know it is a process of differentiation. So there were many more things in there that made these connections more explicit. There are many Gnostic discussions that make these from Egypt, that make these comparisons much more explicit and understandable for people, but they need to be extracted from the text so that people can say, oh no, we are different. And here's another interesting comparison. You know, I mentioned that Osiris is killed by Seth. Right. Seth is, I mean, that's a really interesting one, because Seth in many ways can be identified with Yahweh almost directly, with Baal, with the storm god, with the god of sandstorms and windstorms and great anger and destruction, and you do what I say, or the highway. And this Sethian image, this is what murders Osiris. And it's a little before this time that Seth is actually demonized in Egypt. And they start to go around, polytheists start to go around and chisel away Seth's image from temple spaces, and start to see Seth as a kind of devil, already anticipating Christianity before Christianity is even a thing. So this idea of there being one source of ultimate evil is something that the Egyptians arguably invented as well, and that also spread out into the world. So this idea of having ultimate good, you do have the other side of that coin, and you have the ultimate evil. And Seth, think of him, he has these weird ears and this weird look, or he can be the ibex, he can be an antelope and have horns. And so this idea of a horned devil-like figure, this demonization is part of the pagan process, and it's a process that takes hundreds of years. And so we shouldn't expect these things to be just created as a fait accompli. It takes a long time to make these differentiations, say, no, we're not like this. And think of politicians or president's administration who follows another president. And it's always a he, right? Has got to say, I'm not like the president before me. I'm not going to do those things. And so there's a very overt differentiation from what occurred before. Christianity must do this, but they must also speak to people's hearts and minds and help them to connect with a divinity that feeds their souls. And so they're playing a very dangerous game and walking a very fine line, trying to connect with people with what they need and want in terms of a yearly cycle that is all around them in their world of harvest and resurrection, while at the same time saying, oh, but that's of the devil and this is of the light, and come and follow us. And everything's about money and politics, because money is taken from temples and put into churches. And it's a shift that is happening during the Christianization of the entire Fertile Crescent, Middle East, Levantine, Egyptian space.